Welcome back to Vanguard News, where we dare to expose the dark hidden currents shaping our world, the stories mainstream media won't tell you. Tonight, we pull back the veil on an agency widely perceived as a beacon of humanitarian aid. But what if that popular image is a carefully constructed facade? We're talking about USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. But is development really their primary mission? Or, as many insiders and investigative journalists shockingly allege, is USAID actually operating as the CIA's clandestine arm, a sophisticated cover for global coups and regime change operations, not just in distant lands, but even in strategic hotspots across Asia and beyond? Is USAID truly aid, or a weaponized tool of American power projection, deployed globally from Latin America to Eastern Europe, and now, to the heart of the Indo-Pacific? That is the explosive question we're tackling tonight. Tonight, Vanguard News digs deep into the shadows. We'll uncover USAID's alleged dark side. We'll expose its shocking role in Ukraine. We'll dissect its murky funding streams. And we'll reveal the dire geopolitical consequences from the Americas to Europe to Asia. Are you ready to see what we uncover? Are you ready to see behind the official narrative, wherever it may lead? Are you prepared to question everything you thought you knew about humanitarian aid across the globe? Then stay with Vanguard News. Because tonight, we unveil the unsettling truth behind USAID, the CIA's alleged secret weapon operating on a global scale. From the very moment of its creation in 1961, under the optimistic banner of the Kennedy administration's New Frontier, USAID was meticulously presented to the global stage as an embodiment of American benevolence, a pristine symbol of selfless humanitarianism extending across ideological divides and national borders. President John F. Kennedy himself eloquently articulated this vision, declaring that USAID would be an agency unequivocally dedicated to assisting nations in their pursuit of progress, emphasizing the principles of freedom and independence. But behind this carefully constructed, almost utopian image was the reality of USAID's origins and early operations ever truly as simple and benign as advertised? Born directly into the crucible of the Cold War, a period of intense global ideological confrontation, USAID's fundamental DNA was, from its inception, inextricably interwoven with the fierce geopolitical battle against the Soviet Union, communism, and any perceived threat to American global dominance. The seemingly altruistic promise of disinterested aid, so appealing in its rhetoric, was consistently, almost systematically, accompanied by heavy political strings, tightly attached. Consider, for instance, those pioneering USAID programs launched across Latin America during the 1960s and 70s, a region strategically considered by Washington as its inviolable backyard, crucial for maintaining American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The Alliance for Progress, a multi-billion-dollar, decade-long USAID flagship initiative, was aggressively marketed as a groundbreaking endeavor in economic development, social reform, and poverty alleviation for Latin America. However, scratch beneath the glossy surface of this ambitious program, and the underlying, politically charged motivation becomes starkly, disturbingly clear. The paramount objective was not purely humanitarian betterment, but rather to aggressively curb the spread of communism throughout Latin America, contain Soviet influence in the region, and to resolutely secure and expand U.S. political, economic, and military influence across the hemisphere, effectively preventing the emergence of any further coups that might challenge American dominance. Aid dollars indeed flowed from Washington to Latin America through USAID channels, but this financial assistance was almost invariably contingent upon strict conditions that served the overarching strategic interests of U.S. foreign policy. USAID funds were meticulously directed to propping up anti-communist, often authoritarian regimes deemed friendly to Washington, while simultaneously and systematically undermining left-leaning political movements, labor unions, student groups, and any social forces perceived as even remotely sympathetic to socialist or communist ideologies. Regardless of how democratically oriented or legitimately popular these movements may have been. Was it truly aid in the pure, humanitarian sense of the word, or was it, in reality, a highly calibrated and purposeful tool of geopolitical containment and ideological warfare, ingeniously disguised and strategically deployed under the benevolent-sounding facade of humanitarianism? From its very inception, the chilling shadow of the Cold War loomed ominously over USAID, indelibly casting a long and persistent shadow of deep suspicion upon the agency's self-proclaimed altruistic motives and its ostensibly humanitarian objectives. To truly comprehend and unflinchingly confront the disturbingly darker underside of USAID's operational history, we are compelled to meticulously examine and dissect the infamous Chilean coup d'état of September 1973. This pivotal event is not merely an obscure historical footnote buried in the agency's past. Rather, it stands as a brutally paradigmatic case study, a chilling exemplar that unequivocally exposes USAID's alleged and deeply troubling willingness, indeed, perhaps even its institutional mandate, to proactively meddle in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, actively engage in political subversion, and even facilitate violent regime change operations under the deceptive cloak of aid. In Chile, during the tumultuous early 1970s, USAID's primary target was Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president who, despite his legitimate mandate from the Chilean people, was deemed by Washington as dangerously leftist, and whose progressive policies were perceived as a significant threat to long-standing U.S. economic and geopolitical interests throughout Latin America. Under the superficially appealing banner of democracy promotion and ostensibly with a stated aim of strengthening Chilean civil society, USAID strategically and surreptitiously funneled vast sums of financial resources, millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars, into a meticulously constructed network of Chilean opposition groups actively working to destabilize and ultimately overthrow Allende's democratically elected government. This clandestine funding operation encompassed a broad spectrum of anti-Allende forces, virulently opposition political parties, powerful business associations vehemently opposed to Allende's socialist economic reforms, influential right-wing media outlets engaged in relentless anti-government propaganda, and even strategically important labor unions actively mobilized to instigate strikes and social unrest, crippling the Chilean economy and eroding public support for the Allende administration. Declassified CIA documents, leaked USAID internal memos, and compelling eyewitness accounts from former U.S. officials and Chilean operatives strongly and consistently suggest that this massive influx of USAID funding was not merely incidental, but rather instrumental and decisive in systematically creating the economic chaos, political polarization, and social unrest that ultimately, and tragically, paved the way for the brutal military coup d'état masterminded and led by General Augusto Pinochet on September 11, 1973. When the Chilean Air Force jets mercilessly bombed the La Moneda presidential palace and President Allende perished amidst the flames and gunfire, replaced by the decades-long, blood-soaked, U.S.-backed Pinochet dictatorship, the agonizing, unavoidable questions reverberated across the globe. Did USAID's ostensibly benevolent aid, whether intentionally designed or recklessly implemented, inadvertently or deliberately become a direct catalyst, a key enabler, and perhaps even a partner in this profoundly dark and tragic episode of regime change and democratic subversion? And ultimately, is this the morally bankrupt and politically catastrophic kind of democracy that USAID was, and perhaps still is, truly and covertly promoting across the globe, while strategically obscuring its true agenda behind a carefully crafted humanitarian facade? These questions continue to haunt USAID's legacy, demanding unflinching scrutiny and honest answers that remain, to this day, elusive and deeply disturbing. transcending the ethically murky and politically treacherous realm of covert political interference and regime change operations. A far more prosaic, yet equally corrosive and endemic scandal has relentlessly and persistently plagued USAID's operations across virtually every continent and spanning multiple decades. Widespread, systemic corruption and large-scale embezzlement of taxpayer funds. This isn't merely a case of isolated incidents or occasional bad apples within a generally well-functioning system. Rather, it constitutes a grim, recurring pattern of financial irregularities, mismanagement, and outright theft, documented in countless damning audits, official investigations, whistleblower reports, and even criminal prosecutions. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage, millions upon millions, year after year, of precious U.S. taxpayer dollars, meticulously earmarked and explicitly intended for desperately needed humanitarian relief in disaster zones, crucially important long-term development projects in impoverished nations, and life-saving emergency assistance for the world's most vulnerable populations, simply and inexplicably vanishing into thin air, dissipating into a vast, unaccountable, bureaucratic abyss, or worse, being deliberately siphoned OFF and diverted into private pockets, corrupt networks, and elaborate patronage schemes. Consider the staggering examples. In war-torn Afghanistan, billions of US aid dollars were ostensibly poured into post-conflict reconstruction efforts under USAID management. However, official audits and journalistic investigations have revealed that vast sums were systematically lost to widespread fraud, gross mismanagement, and endemic kickbacks, leaving countless crucial infrastructure projects unfinished, vital aid supplies undistributed, and the Afghan people largely unaided. In post-invasion Iraq, a similar, tragically familiar narrative unfolded, with credible reports and investigations detailing how billions of dollars allocated for reconstruction and humanitarian assistance were inexplicably wasted on phantom projects, corrupt contractors, and non-existent aid initiatives, further destabilizing the already fractured nation and enriching a select few while the Iraqi population continued to suffer. Across the vast continent of Africa, consistent, damning reports emerge detailing how significant portions of USAID aid money are systematically siphoned OFF by corrupt local officials, nepotistic patronage networks, and elaborate fraudulent schemes, effectively enriching local political and economic elites while the desperately intended beneficiaries, impoverished communities, famine-stricken populations, and disease-ravaged villages, remain tragically and predictably trapped in cycles of poverty, deprivation, and disease. Even within Latin America, a region historically and persistently plagued by corruption and weak governance, numerous USAID programs, despite their ostensibly noble aims, have been indelibly tainted by credible allegations of embezzlement, financial misuse, and lack of accountability, casting a dark shadow over the supposed effectiveness and ethical integrity of the agency's operations. Where does the money really go? This haunting question echoes across continents and decades, demanding a brutally honest answer. Is USAID, at its operational core, a genuinely effective and ethically sound agency valiantly struggling against logistical and bureaucratic challenges to deliver vital aid to those in desperate need worldwide? Or has it, perhaps more accurately, metamorphosed into a colossal, inefficient, bloated bureaucracy, inherently and systemically prone to rampant waste, large-scale fraud, and endemic financial abuse, with institutionalized corruption almost irremovably baked directly into its operational structure and its deeply flawed organizational culture? The sheer magnitude and persistent recurrence of documented financial irregularities and corruption scandals spanning decades and continents irrefutably raises profound, morally devastating questions about USAID's fundamental accountability, its operational effectiveness, and its very ethical legitimacy in the global aid landscape. Venturing into the most conspiratorial, shadowy, and profoundly disturbing territory of inquiry, yet one consistently fueled by credible allegations and persistent whispers from within the intelligence community itself, we must confront USAID's deeply unsettling and often vehemently denied connections to front non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and clandestine intelligence operations. This is no longer mere speculative conjecture or unfounded conspiracy theory. Rather, numerous former CIA operatives, retired intelligence experts, and hard-nosed investigative journalists have, over the years, presented compelling and increasingly difficult-to-dismiss evidence strongly suggesting a systematic and deliberate pattern of USAID's utilization as a sophisticated and highly effective soft power cover for a wide range of clandestine activities fundamentally and irreconcilably divorced from the agency's officially stated humanitarian mission. These well-placed sources allege, with increasing levels of corroborating detail, that USAID has been strategically and covertly employed as a clandestine arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Itself, a seemingly innocuous and benevolent aid facade cleverly concealing a far more sinister and politically motivated agenda. Think of the implications. Ostensibly independent NGOs, explicitly presented to the world as grassroots, non-political organizations solely dedicated to humanitarian work, systematically receiving substantial USAID funding and, more disturbingly, clandestine direction from U.S. intelligence agencies. But these are demonstrably not just any ordinary NGOs engaged in impartial aid delivery. Rather, a significant number of these USAID-funded entities have been repeatedly and convincingly linked to undercover intelligence gathering operations, covert military activities, and clandestine regime change efforts orchestrated by the CIA and other U.S. government agencies. These front NGOs, operating under the protective umbrella of USAID funding and humanitarian legitimacy, allegedly become invaluable tools for a complex array of covert actions, clandestinely gathering critical intelligence on foreign governments, political movements, and strategic regions under the pretense of conducting aid assessments, strategically promoting pro-US political agendas, and undermining unfriendly regimes through subtle influence operations and carefully targeted democracy promotion programs, and even, in the most extreme and morally reprehensible cases, actively participating in destabilization campaigns, orchestrating political unrest, and facilitating covert regime change operations in strategically important nations deemed adversarial to U.S. interests. Is USAID, therefore, in its operational essence, primarily a genuine, independent aid agency, truly committed to its stated humanitarian mission, as its carefully crafted public image so relentlessly insists? Or is it also, and perhaps more disturbingly, insignificant and strategically crucial part, a highly sophisticated and deeply problematic extension of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, a clandestine instrument for covert operations and geopolitical maneuvering operating systematically and deceptively under a carefully constructed humanitarian mask? Where, in the murky operational reality of USAID, does legitimate and ethically defensible aid definitively yendy and morally dubious, legally questionable, and geopolitically dangerous covert actions strategically begin? And perhaps most critically, in this shadow realm of blurred lines and deceptive facades, who is really and ultimately in control, guiding the agency's true and often hidden agenda, and pulling the clandestine operational levers behind the benevolent humanitarian curtain? These deeply unsettling questions, fueled by credible allegations and persistent insider accounts, demand urgent and transparent answers that USAID and the U.S. government have consistently and conspicuously failed to provide to a deeply concerned and increasingly skeptical global audience. Let us now pivot our analytical focus to the tragically embattled nation of Ukraine, a country currently and agonizingly positioned at the very epicenter of a global geopolitical storm, and meticulously examine USAID's decades-long, deeply consequential, and intensely debated involvement within its borders. For literally decades, stretching back even before Ukraine's hard-won independence from the collapsing Soviet Union in 1991, USAID has been extremely active and deeply enmeshed in Ukrainian affairs, strategically and systematically pouring vast sums of financial resources, conservatively estimated to be in the multi-billion-dollar range, directly and indirectly into the amorphous and strategically malleable sphere of Ukrainian civil society. On the meticulously crafted public surface, USAID's stated narrative is predictably benign, even inherently noble and self-congratulatory. Democracy promotion, institutional strengthening, supporting independent media, and fostering good governance are the recurrently cited, rhetorically appealing objectives prominently featured in USAID's official pronouncements and public relations materials regarding its extensive Ukrainian operations. This ostensibly benevolent aid apparatus involved the systematic channeling of massive financial flows to a sprawling and strategically positioned network of Ukrainian NGOs, carefully vetted media outlets, influential think tanks, activist organizations, and grassroots movements, all ostensibly united in their shared commitment to building a more robustly democratic, economically prosperous, and Western-aligned Ukraine. But beneath this carefully constructed, propagandistically appealing facade of selfless assistance and democratic benevolence, did this decades-long, multi-billion-dollar investment operation in Ukrainian civil society remain truly, unquestionably benign, and utterly free of any unintended, or perhaps even deliberate, negative geopolitical consequences? Increasingly vocal and credible critics across the geopolitical spectrum vehemently argue that USAID's decades-long approach in Ukraine, while artfully couched in the palatable rhetoric of democracy promotion, was in fact deeply and fundamentally flawed in its strategic assumptions, reckless in its implementation, and ultimately, profoundly counterproductive in its tragic outcomes. These analysts contend that by systematically and selectively funding Ukrainian groups and organizations exhibiting a palpable anti-Russian and overtly pro-Western political bias, USAID inadvertently, or perhaps more cynically, intentionally contributed to the deep and pervasive polarization of Ukrainian society, actively undermined the nation's fragile political balance, eroded prospects for genuine national unity and inclusive dialogue, and, with tragic and almost predictable inevitability, unwittingly, or perhaps willfully, the way for the devastating, ongoing crisis and brutal conflict we are so agonizingly witnessing in Ukraine today. Was this immense, decades-long, multi-billion-dollar aid operation in Ukraine genuinely and unequivocally designed to sustainably help the Ukrainian people build a truly independent and prosperous nation? Or did it, in tragic reality, inadvertently or deliberately sow the seeds of deep-rooted division, internal strife, and ultimately, violent conflict, unleashing a geopolitical whirlwind with devastating consequences for Ukraine and the wider global order? Was it genuinely aid for authentic Ukrainian democracy, or a strategically myopic and ultimately catastrophic recipe for national disintegration and regional disaster? The weight of evidence and the agonizingly unfolding tragedy in Ukraine strongly suggest the latter, far more disturbing conclusion. The inherently and demonstrably selective nature of USAID's voluminous funding apparatus within Ukraine stands as a central and intensely controversial point of contention, and arguably the most damning indictment of the agency's true geopolitical agenda in the region. While USAID publicly and repeatedly insists that its aid is impartially directed towards civil society writ large, aiming to strengthen democratic institutions across the board and promote inclusive societal development, accumulating evidence and detailed analyses of funding patterns and recipient organizations strongly and unequivocally suggest a systematic and alarming bias. A disproportionately vast share of USAID's financial resources, year after year, has demonstrably flowed towards Ukrainian organizations, media outlets, and activist groups that are openly, often aggressively, hostile to Russia, viscerally critical of any vestige of Russian influence within Ukraine, and ardently eager for rapid and deep integration with the West, particularly with NATO and the European Union. Conversely, and equally tellingly, Ukrainian groups and media platforms advocating for closer, more cooperative relations with Russia, or even simply promoting a more neutral, non-aligned geopolitical stance for Ukraine, have consistently received significantly less, often vanishingly small, USAID financial support, if any discernible funding at all. This demonstrably pronounced funding bias, unequivocally favoring explicitly anti-Russian and pro-Western political actors within Ukraine, critics vehemently argue, was demonstrably not simply a matter of neutrally promoting abstract democracy and good governance in a balanced and impartial manner. Rather, it actively and strategically functioned as a potent mechanism for deliberately and systematically shaping Ukrainian public opinion and the entire Ukrainian political landscape in a decisively and aggressively pro-Western geopolitical direction, fundamentally and dangerously at the direct expense of long-term national unity, internal political balance, and any prospect for genuinely inclusive and consensual dialogue within deeply divided Ukrainian society. By strategically and disproportionately empowering one ideologically and geopolitically skewed side of the Ukrainian political spectrum while systematically marginalizing and under-resourcing alternative perspectives and voices, did USAID, under the deceptively benign guise of aid, inadvertently or deliberately irreversibly exacerbate already existing divisions within Ukrainian society, significantly fuel anti-Russian sentiment, and aggressively create a pervasively toxic climate of escalating political polarization and deeply entrenched geopolitical confrontation that tragically, and perhaps predictably, made the descent into violent internal conflict and ultimately devastating external war not merely more likely, but almost virtually inevitable? Is this demonstrably selective and ideologically biased funding pattern truly, in any meaningful sense, humanitarian intervention? Or is it a more cynical and strategically calculated form of external political manipulation, with profoundly destructive consequences for the very nation it ostensibly purports to aid and assist? The ethical and geopolitical implications of this skewed funding model are deeply troubling and demand unflinching critical scrutiny. The deeply troubling pattern of USAID's strategically selective and ideologically skewed funding operations in Ukraine is far from an isolated anomaly. Rather, it chillingly echoes a demonstrably broader, systemic, and deeply disturbing pattern. USAID's repeated, and often decisive, implication in the controversial and frequently destabilizing phenomenon of the so-called color revolutions that aggressively swept across the post-Soviet landscape of Eastern Europe and strategically vital regions of Central Asia in the early years of the 21st century. From Georgia's highly contentious Rose Revolution of 2003 to Kyrgyzstan's turbulent Tulip Revolution of 2005, and most conspicuously and consequentially, Ukraine's deeply divisive Orange Revolution of 2004 and the violently contested Maidan Revolution of 2014. USAID-funded organizations and US-backed activist networks were consistently positioned at the very forefront of protest movements that systematically and strategically challenged, undermined, and ultimately, in several cases, violently toppled legitimately established sovereign governments deemed insufficiently pro-Western or insufficiently compliant with U.S. geopolitical imperatives. These externally fueled and strategically orchestrated protest movements were consistently and almost uniformly portrayed within the dominant Western media narrative as spontaneous, organic, grassroots democratic uprisings, authentic manifestations of popular while valiantly rising up against authoritarian regimes and oppressive post-Soviet oligarchies. But is this meticulously crafted and relentlessly propagated narrative of spontaneous democratic revolution truly an accurate and complete representation of the complex and often deeply troubling geopolitical reality unfolding on the ground? Increasingly credible and vociferous critics across the geopolitical spectrum vehemently argue that these so-called revolutions, while perhaps undeniably incorporating certain elements of genuine popular discontent, legitimate grievances, and authentically democratic aspirations, were also, and perhaps more fundamentally, carefully orchestrated, externally fueled, and strategically managed campaigns of large-scale geopolitical social engineering, with USAID operating strategically and often clandestinely behind the scenes, playing a central, indispensable, and often decisive role in their planning, funding, and execution. USAID financial resources, meticulously and strategically channeled through a vast and complex network of strategically positioned NGOs and carefully cultivated media outlets, allegedly provided absolutely crucial organizational, logistical, financial, and even propaganda support to strategically targeted opposition movements, systematically and effectively helping them to mobilize mass protests, undermine state authority, orchestrate sophisticated information warfare campaigns, and ultimately, to violently seize power through extra-constitutional means, often at the direct expense of national stability, sovereign integrity, and long-term democratic consolidation. Is USAID, therefore, genuinely and solely in the business of aiding the organic, bottom-up, authentically spontaneous development of indigenous democracy within sovereign nations, as its public relations narrative relentlessly proclaims? Or is it, far more disturbingly and consequentially, actively and systematically engaged in a sophisticated, globalized form of top-down, externally driven regime change operations, cynically and strategically weaponizing aid as a potent instrument of geopolitical manipulation, neo-colonial intervention, and strategically destabilizing global power projection? The mounting evidence and the consistently troubling patterns of USAID's involvement in color revolutions across the globe strongly suggest the latter, far more disturbing conclusion. Is this democracy promotion in any meaningful sense, or is it something far more manipulative, interventionist, and ultimately profoundly anti-democratic in its actual global impact and its long-term geopolitical consequences? Taking a critical and strategically panoramic step back and meticulously considering the broader geopolitical chessboard of great power competition, a profoundly chilling and strategically inescapable perspective urgently demands our unwavering attention. Is USAID's decades-long, massively scaled, multi-billion-dollar aid operation in Ukraine, and by undeniable extension, in numerous strategically analogous geopolitical contexts around the globe, primarily and fundamentally concerned with genuinely and impartially assisting the Ukrainian people in building a more prosperous and democratic nation, as the agency's carefully crafted public relations messaging so tirelessly insists? Or, far more disturbingly and consequentially, is it in reality, and at its operational core, strategically and relentlessly oriented towards the far more aggressive, politically charged, and ultimately destabilizing objective of actively and systematically advancing a larger, overarching U.S. geopolitical strategy, particularly and pointedly aimed at strategically containing and decisively weakening long-term geopolitical rivals, most prominently Russia and, increasingly, China? In the specific and tragically illustrative case of Ukraine, numerous seasoned geopolitical analysts, intelligence experts, and foreign policy observers across the ideological spectrum persuasively argue that USAID's decades-long, multi-billion-dollar investment in Ukrainian civil society was demonstrably and fundamentally not primarily about neutral democracy promotion in detached geopolitical isolation. Instead, they contend, it was strategically and systemically designed to function as a critical component in a much larger, far more ambitious, and ultimately far more dangerous U.S. geopolitical strategy explicitly intended to aggressively contain and decisively weaken Russia's historical sphere of influence within its strategically vital near abroad, strategically and relentlessly drawing Ukraine firmly and irreversibly into the Western orbit of influence, particularly under the aegis of NATO and the European Union, and ultimately, to systematically and strategically undermine Moscow's long-term geopolitical power, economic leverage, and regional security on its strategically critical western border. Viewed through this starkly realistic and geopolitically informed analytical lens, USAID's multifaceted and massively funded activities in Ukraine, ranging from strategically funding demonstrably pro-Western civil society groups and media outlets to aggressively supporting anti-corruption initiatives meticulously targeted at undermining pro-Russian political factions and oligarchic networks, and proactively promoting Ukraine's eventual integration into NATO's expanding military alliance, become far less about genuinely impartial aid to the Ukrainian people and far more about strategically calibrated instruments of deliberate power projection, purposefully deployed and strategically weaponized as potent tools in a high-stakes, zero-sum geopolitical game aggressively waged by Washington and its NATO allies against a resurgent and increasingly assertive Moscow, is humanitarian aid. In this increasingly cynical and alarming geopolitical context, being systematically and strategically weaponized in the rapidly intensifying new Cold War between resurgent global powers? And is USAID, therefore, not merely an impartial aid agency, but rather a highly problematic and deeply consequential geopolitical weapon in this increasingly dangerous and potentially globally destabilizing new era of great power confrontation? Is the benevolent humanitarian FOD, so meticulously and relentlessly propagated by USAID and its allies in the dominant Western media, strategically and cynically masking a far more troubling, aggressive, and ultimately profoundly dangerous geopolitical reality beneath the surface of its meticulously crafted public image? These are the agonizing and increasingly unavoidable questions that must be unflinchingly confronted and honestly answered if we are to truly understand USAID's complex, controversial, and deeply consequential role in the tragically unfolding Ukrainian crisis and in the increasingly volatile and strategically precarious global order of the 21st century. Let us now meticulously and unflinchingly dissect the highly sensitive, politically charged, and strategically revealing issue of money flows within the vast and increasingly opaque USAID bureaucracy. USAID, it is absolutely crucial to underscore at the outset, is categorically not a small, grassroots charity operating on a shoestring budget. It has, in reality, metamorphosed into a gargantuan, multi-layered bureaucracy, an almost unimaginably massive and sprawling global apparatus that operates on a financial scale that is, frankly, approaching the astronomical and alarming. Year after year, USAID's publicly disclosed annual budgets routinely, almost as a matter of institutional routine, surpass the billion-dollar threshold, often reaching into the tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars, rivaling, and in some cases even exceeding, the annual gross domestic products, GDPs, of entire nations in the developing world that it ostensibly aims to assist. Moreover, and even more disconcertingly from a perspective of fiscal accountability and responsible governance, this already gargantuan financial behemoth is demonstrably and unequivocally not static in its scale and scope. Rather, USAID's total annual budgets have demonstrably undergone a sustained period of exponential and often unexplained growth over the course of recent decades, particularly and conspicuously in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on U.S. soil and the subsequent, globally expansive launch of Washington's so-called global war on terror. In the fiscal year 2023, for example, USAID's official budget request to the U.S. Congress reached a mind-boggling and ethically questionable figure of substantially over $30 billion US dollars, a sum of public money that dwarfs the combined annual budgets of numerous UN humanitarian agencies and exceeds the developmental spending of the vast majority of nations on Earth. But does this jaw-dropping, almost incomprehensibly massive annual budget figure and its demonstrably exponential growth trajectory over time truly and legitimately reflect a corresponding, quantifiable, and ethically justifiable surge in genuine, effective humanitarian aid meticulously delivered and demonstrably received by vulnerable populations in desperate need across the globe? Or is this unprecedented financial explosion within the USAID bureaucracy driven by fundamentally different, less benign, and potentially far more geopolitically motivated imperatives entirely? When critically compared to other major international aid agencies worldwide, or even more disturbingly, compared to certain massive military budgets of major global powers and aggressive military alliances, USAID's sheer scale of financial expenditure and its rapidly accelerating budgetary growth trajectory inevitably raises serious and profoundly uncomfortable ethical questions about resource allocation, global priorities, and the true nature of U.S. foreign policy objectives disguised beneath the veneer of aid. Are these tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars being efficiently, effectively, and ethically used to alleviate human suffering and promote sustainable development on a truly global scale, as USAID's official narrative relentlessly insists? Or are we, in reality, witnessing the unchecked and largely unaccountable financial bloating of a colossal, inefficient, and potentially corrupt bureaucracy, fundamentally more oriented towards the exercise of geopolitical power and the clandestine pursuit of undeclared strategic objectives than towards the selfless delivery of genuine humanitarian aid in a genuinely impartial and ethically defensible manner? The staggering scale of USAID's financial operations and its increasingly questionable budgetary priorities unavoidably demands rigorous public scrutiny, independent auditing, and a fundamental reevaluation of the agency's true mission and its ultimate impact on the global stage. To truly and unflinchingly comprehend the deeply obscured, deliberately convoluted, and ultimately profoundly troubling complexities of USAID's routine financial operations, one must meticulously navigate and critically dissect the agency's deliberately labyrinthine and almost intentionally opaque system of financial subcontracting. In a striking and arguably deeply problematic departure from traditional aid delivery models employed by other international humanitarian organizations, USAID, in practice, almost never delivers aid directly to recipient populations or to host nation governments on the ground. Instead, USAID categorically functions, in its financial and operational essence, primarily and overwhelmingly as a gargantuan, multi-tiered funding agency, strategically and systematically channeling its vast, billion-dollar budgets through an extraordinarily complex, deliberately obfuscated, and almost impenetrably opaque web of thousands upon thousands of strategically selected non-governmental organizations, NGOs, private sector contractors, for-profit consulting firms, academic institutions, and even faith-based organizations, both domestically within the United States and, increasingly, internationally based in strategically important geopolitical regions across the globe. This elaborate and intentionally decentralized subcontracting model, USAID officials and their allied apologists routinely and predictably claim, is ostensibly meticulously designed and strategically implemented to maximize operational efficiency, strategically leverage highly specialized expertise purportedly located within these external implementing partners, and to supposedly ensure the most flexible and responsive delivery of aid assistance on the ground, circumventing allegedly inefficient host nation bureaucracies and ensuring that aid reaches its intended beneficiaries directly and effectively. But does this deliberately complex, multi-layered system of financial subcontracting really and truthfully enhance operational efficiency, transparency, and accountability in USAID's global aid delivery operations? Or does it, in stark and disturbing reality, systematically and strategically function to create an almost impenetrable, deliberately obscure, and ethically questionable wall of financial opacity and bureaucratic complexity, making it virtually, if not entirely, impossible for independent auditors, governmental oversight bodies, or even concerned citizens to truly and accurately track the ultimate destination of vast sums of U.S. taxpayer money, or to definitively determine where the billions of dollars in aid actually and ultimately end up, and for what specific purposes they are ultimately deployed, and to whose ultimate benefit. Increasingly vocal and highly credible critics vehemently argue that this labyrinthine subcontracting web, far from enhancing efficiency and accountability, in reality strategically and systematically creates almost unlimited opportunities for rampant waste, large-scale fraud, pervasive financial mismanagement, and deeply entrenched corruption within the USAID aid delivery apparatus, effectively shielding the agency from genuine public scrutiny and external accountability. Funds demonstrably pass through multiple, obscure layers of intermediaries, from prime contractors based in Washington, D.C. to a cascade of SUB contractors, SUB contractors, and often shadowy, implementing partners located in far-flung corners of the globe, often in regions with weak governance, endemic corruption, and minimal regulatory oversight. Each layer in this complex, deliberately obfuscated financial chain inevitably shaves OFF a percentage, FORB administrative costs, overhead, consultancy fees, program support, and a myriad of other vaguely defined, difficult-to-verify categories, dramatically diluting the actual aid dollars that eventually, if at all, trickle down to the intended recipient communities and populations on the ground. Contracts are frequently and demonstrably awarded through non-transparent processes, often behind closed doors, with minimal competitive bidding, raising widespread and entirely legitimate suspicions of nepotism, cronyism, and outright corruption in the contracting process itself. And perhaps most damningly, the lack of effective tracking mechanisms within this Byzantine subcontracting maze renders it virtually impossible to definitively audit the entire flow of funds from the initial USAID allocation in Washington to the final expenditure on the ground, creating vast and unaccountable black holes where billions of dollars can simply vanish, leaving behind a gaping void of financial opacity and ethical impunity. Is this deliberately convoluted and opaque subcontracting maze genuinely designed for maximally efficient aid delivery in complex global environments, as USAID persistently claims? Or is it, in stark and disturbing reality, a strategically engineered and institutionally perpetuated mechanism for systematic financial obscuration, purposefully shielding USAID from legitimate public scrutiny and independent accountability, and effectively facilitating the ongoing flow of U.S. taxpayer money into potentially corrupt and ethically questionable channels, with minimal oversight and vanishingly little transparency? Following the USAID money trail within this subcontracting labyrinth often proves to be a frustrating, if not impossible task, leading dedicated auditors, investigative journalists, and concerned citizens down a series of bureaucratic dead ends and strategically erected walls of silence, leaving the global public, and indeed the U.S. taxpayer, almost entirely in the dark regarding the true and ultimate destination of vast sums of ostensibly humanitarian aid. This deliberate opacity in financial flows inevitably leads to the next critical area of concern: the glaring lack of independent oversight and accountability. Multiple, obscure layers of intermediaries, from prime contractors based in Washington, D.C. to a cascade of SUB contractors, SUB contractors, and often shadowy, implementing partners located in far-flung corners of the globe, often in regions with weak governance, endemic corruption, and minimal regulatory oversight. Each layer in this complex, deliberately obfuscated financial chain inevitably shaves OFF a percentage, FORB administrative costs, overhead, consultancy fees, program support, and a myriad of other vaguely defined, difficult-to-verify categories, dramatically diluting the actual aid dollars that eventually, if at all, trickle down to the intended recipient communities and populations on the ground. Contracts are frequently and demonstrably awarded through non-transparent processes, often behind closed doors, with minimal competitive bidding, raising widespread and entirely legitimate suspicions of nepotism, cronyism, and outright corruption in the contracting process itself. And perhaps most damningly, the lack of effective tracking mechanisms within this Byzantine subcontracting maze renders it virtually impossible to definitively audit the entire flow of funds from the initial USAID allocation in Washington to the final expenditure on the ground, creating vast and unaccountable black holes where billions of dollars can simply vanish, leaving behind a gaping void of financial opacity and ethical impunity. Is this deliberately convoluted and opaque subcontracting maze genuinely designed for maximally efficient aid delivery in complex global environments, as USAID persistently claims? Or is it, in stark and disturbing reality, a strategically engineered and institutionally perpetuated mechanism for systematic financial obscuration, purposefully shielding USAID from legitimate public scrutiny and independent accountability, and effectively facilitating the ongoing flow of U.S. taxpayer money into potentially corrupt and ethically questionable channels, with minimal oversight and vanishingly little transparency? Following the USAID money trail within this subcontracting labyrinth often proves to be a frustrating, if not impossible task, leading dedicated auditors, investigative journalists, and concerned citizens down a series of bureaucratic dead ends and strategically erected walls of silence, leaving the global public, and indeed the U.S. taxpayer, almost entirely in the dark regarding the true and ultimate destination of vast sums of ostensibly humanitarian aid. This deliberate opacity in financial flows inevitably brings us face to face with perhaps the most critical and ethically damning aspect of USAID's operational structure: the glaring and alarming lack of truly independent audits and effective mechanisms for robust citizen oversight over the agency's sprawling, multi-billion-dollar global operations. While USAID officials and apologists routinely point to the agency's internal oversight mechanisms, including its own Office of Inspector General, OIG, as evidence of accountability and responsible financial stewardship, critical analysts and transparency advocates across the political spectrum vehemently argue that these internal oversight structures are demonstrably and fundamentally insufficient, lack genuine independence, and are ultimately ineffective in holding the agency truly accountable to the U.S. taxpayer, to international beneficiaries, and to the principles of ethical and transparent governance. The crucial and deeply troubling reality is this: USAID's internal watchdogs, including the OIG, are essentially and inherently policing themselves, operating within the agency's bureaucratic structure, subject to internal political pressures, and ultimately beholden to USAID leadership for their budgets, career advancement, and operational scope. There is demonstrably no equivalent of a truly independent, external body, entirely free from USAID's internal bureaucratic influence, political interference from the executive branch, or capture by vested agency interests, empowered to rigorously and impartially scrutinize USAID's vast finances and complex global operations with unwavering independence and full transparency. The U.S. Congress, theoretically tasked with overseeing the executive branch and its agencies, has demonstrably proven itself incapable or unwilling to provide effective, consistent, and truly independent oversight of USAID's multi-billion-dollar budget and its far-reaching global activities, often deferring to the agency's self-serving assurances and lacking the political will or investigative capacity to conduct truly rigorous and independent audits. Who then is really watching USAID? Who is truly holding this massive, multi-billion-dollar agency accountable for its expenditure of taxpayer funds and for the ethical and geopolitical consequences of its global operations? In the absence of robust independent audits, transparent financial disclosure, and effective mechanisms for empowered citizen oversight, the door remains alarmingly wide open for systemic lack of accountability, potential institutional impunity, and the persistent, unrelenting threat of widespread corruption, financial mismanagement, and the potential misuse of vast public resources for undeclared and questionable geopolitical agendas. Is it not, therefore, imperative and ethically mandatory for any democratic society to demand a radical shift towards genuine transparency, robust independent oversight, and meaningful public accountability for an agency as powerful, financially gargantuan, and geopolitically influential as USAID? Who, ultimately, will vigilate the vigilante, if not empowered independent watchdogs, a free and unfettered press, and an informed and engaged citizenry demanding accountability and transparency from their government and its sprawling global aid apparatus? The future of ethical and effective foreign aid, and indeed the very credibility of USAID's humanitarian mission, may well hinge on answering these crucial questions with unflinching honesty and demanding fundamental reforms. When we meticulously and unflinchingly assemble the deeply troubling puzzle pieces of USAID's financial operations, the astronomical and largely unjustified budgets, the labyrinthine and deliberately opaque subcontracting system, the glaring lack of truly independent audits and robust citizen oversight, a profoundly unsettling, even chilling, overall picture inescapably emerges. Could USAID, despite its carefully crafted and relentlessly promoted public image of humanitarian benevolence and selfless aid provision, be, in significant and strategically crucial part, functionally operating as a vast, global financial black box? A sprawling, largely unaccountable, multi-billion-dollar entity, systematically channeling vast sums of U.S. taxpayer money through deliberately obscured and ethically questionable channels, potentially and strategically serving hidden, undeclared interests and clandestine geopolitical agendas. Fundamentally and demonstrably far removed from its officially stated humanitarian mission and ethical obligations, is USAID's complex and deliberately opaque financial structure strategically and meticulously designed not primarily for the efficient and transparent delivery of genuine aid to those in desperate need, but rather for effectively facilitating clandestine operations, untraceable funding of politically sensitive and ethically questionable projects, and the systematic maintenance of a deliberately high degree of financial secrecy and institutional opacity that is fundamentally and irreconcilably incompatible with the principles of democratic accountability, transparency, and ethical governance in the spending of public funds. The cumulative weight of evidence, the persistent patterns of financial irregularities and corruption scandals, the documented instances of politically motivated funding and regime change operations, and the glaring lack of genuine independent oversight, strongly and disturbingly suggests that the answer to these agonizing questions may well be a resounding and ethically devastating yes. Is USAID, in the 21st century, and despite its ostensibly humanitarian mandate, in danger of functioning, or perhaps demonstrably already functioning, as a vast, largely unaccountable, and potentially deeply problematic financial black box within the vast machinery of the U.S. government and its global power projection apparatus? Is it time to demand concrete and radical answers, to forcefully demand the strategic opening of this financial black box to independent scrutiny, to demand radical and unprecedented levels of financial transparency and ethical accountability from USAID, and to aggressively expose the potentially inconvenient but ethically imperative truth about where the billions of dollars in U.S. taxpayer money channeled through USAID are really, ultimately going, and for what specific and often hidden purposes they are truly and strategically being utilized on the global stage? The integrity of U.S. foreign policy, the ethical standing of U.S. aid programs worldwide, and the very credibility of USAID's self-proclaimed humanitarian mission may well critically depend on our collective willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths and to demand fundamental and irreversible reform before it is definitively too late to salvage the agency's ethical core and restore public trust in its global operations. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. This age-old adage, steeped in cynical wisdom and historical observation, resonates with chilling accuracy and unsettling relevance when we critically examine the demonstrably negative and devastating geopolitical consequences consistently associated with USAID's extensive global interventions, particularly its signature and relentlessly promoted program of democracy promotion. While USAID, in its carefully crafted public pronouncements and official documentation, unwaveringly presents its purported intentions as inherently noble and universally beneficial, passionately committed to fostering democratic values, strengthening fragile democratic institutions, and empowering civil society actors across diverse and often volatile global contexts. The stark and undeniable real-world outcomes empirically observed on the ground, across numerous continents and diverse political landscapes, often paint a drastically different and profoundly more disturbing picture of unintended, or perhaps even intended, geopolitical fallout. In country after country, stretching across the strategically vital regions of the Middle East, the politically unstable continent of Africa, and the historically turbulent landscape of Latin America, USAID-led democracy promotion initiatives, however rhetorically appealing and ostensibly well-meaning in their stated objectives, have been demonstrably and repeatedly followed by alarming and tragic sequences of chaos, widespread instability, deep-seated political polarization, systemic erosion of state authority, and in the most extreme and devastating cases, brutal escalations into violent internal and regional conflict. Think, for instance, of the Libyan calamity, where USAID's extensive democracy programs, focused on empowering NGOs and promoting civil society, demonstrably preceded, and in some analyses, contributed to, the ill-fated NATO-led military intervention in 2011 and the subsequent, predictable, and tragically ongoing descent of Libya into anarchy. State collapse and protracted civil war, transforming a relatively stable, albeit authoritarian, nation into a fractured, ungovernable, and violence-ridden failed state. Consider next the Afghanistan fiasco, a 2-decade-long, trillion-dollar US-led nation-building project where billions upon billions of US taxpayer dollars, a significant portion channeled through USAID's vast aid apparatus, were ostensibly invested in democracy building, institutional reform, and civil society empowerment, yet ultimately and spectacularly failed to create a viable, stable, or remotely democratic Afghan state, paving the way for the ignominious U.S. withdrawal in 2021 and the swift, almost unopposed, Taliban takeover, effectively returning Afghanistan to theocratic authoritarian rule and erasing any vestige of Western-style democratic governance. Reflect further on the deeply troubling case of Haiti, a Caribbean nation historically plagued by political instability and chronic poverty, where decades of sustained and extensive USAID involvement, ostensibly aimed at promoting development and strengthening democratic institutions, have become inextricably intertwined with persistent political turmoil, endemic corruption, state fragility, and a cycle of recurrent violence and social disintegration, leaving Haiti arguably worse off, more unstable, and more impoverished today than it was decades ago, despite the billions of aid dollars poured into the nation through USAID channels. Are these tragically recurring patterns of post-USAID intervention chaos, state failure, and escalating conflict in diverse geopolitical contexts across the globe merely unfortunate and entirely unintended consequences, isolated anomalies, and unpredictable side effects of inherently well-meaning, if perhaps strategically misguided, humanitarian and democracy promotion efforts gone tragically awry? Or are they, perhaps more disturbingly, the logical, predictable, and even inherently intentional outcomes of a fundamentally flawed, ideologically driven, neo-imperialistic approach to externally imposed democracy promotion that systematically disregards deeply ingrained local realities, profoundly misreads complex socio-political dynamics, and aggressively imposes externally conceived agendas and Western-centric models of governance upon nations and societies demonstrably unready and often actively resistant to such externally driven transformations? Is USAID, therefore, in its relentless and often heavy-handed quest to aggressively spread its particular brand of externally defined democracy across the globe, inadvertently or even intentionally, systematically breeding global chaos, state disintegration, and escalating conflict, effectively undermining the very stability and long-term peace it ostensibly purports to be so valiantly promoting? The mounting and deeply disturbing empirical evidence, spanning continents and decades, increasingly suggests that USAID's democracy promotion paradigm, far from being a benevolent force for global betterment, may in fact be a significant and deeply problematic catalyst for geopolitical instability and tragic human suffering on a truly global scale. Critical analysts and increasingly vocal geopolitical observers go even further in their damning assessments of USAID's global operations, arguing with mounting evidence and increasing conviction that USAID's expansive aid apparatus is demonstrably not merely ineffective or strategically misguided in its purported humanitarian and democracy promotion objectives. Rather, these critics contend, USAID's global interventions actively and systematically serve a far more sinister and deeply entrenched hidden geopolitical agenda: the deliberate and systematic weakening of sovereign governments across the globe, strategically classified as non-aligned with core U.S. geopolitical and economic interests, and the strategically calculated promotion and consolidation of governments and regimes that are demonstrably favorable and unquestioningly compliant with Washington's dominant global ambitions and hegemonic imperatives. These critics argue, is demonstrably not about neutrally and impartially helping people in need or objectively fostering democratic values for their own sake. Instead, it is fundamentally and aggressively about strategically manipulating global political landscapes, systematically re-engineering geopolitical power dynamics, and proactively undermining any and all forms of sovereign national resistance to U.S. global dominance and unipolar hegemony. The core accusation, leveled with increasing frequency and mounting empirical support, is that USAID aid is strategically and ruthlessly selectively deployed as a potent geopolitical weapon meticulously designed and aggressively utilized to systematically target, isolate, and ultimately undermine sovereign governments that demonstrably resist U.S. foreign policy objectives, actively challenge U.S. global hegemony, or consistently pursue independent paths of national development that diverge from Washington's preferred neoliberal economic and political models. By strategically channeling massive funding and extensive logistical support to carefully selected opposition groups within targeted nations, by systematically supporting independent media outlets relentlessly critical of incumbent regimes deemed unfriendly to Washington, and by proactively promoting narratives and ideologies that strategically delegitimize and demonize democratically elected but non-aligned governments in the eyes of both domestic and international public opinion, USAID allegedly and systematically works to deliberately weaken the legitimacy, erode the popular support, and undermine the functional capacity of these targeted governments, effectively and strategically softening them up for future external intervention, internal political upheaval, or U.S.-backed regime change operations, ultimately paving the way for the installation of strategically more pliable, politically more compliant, and economically more subservient pro-U.S. leaders and regimes demonstrably more amenable to Washington's global agenda and neoliberal economic imperatives. Is aid, therefore, being cynically and systematically weaponized as a highly effective tool of neo-colonial power projection in the 21st century? Is it being strategically and ruthlessly deployed as a subtle but profoundly potent instrument to systematically undermine national sovereignty, violate international law, and actively impose U.S. geopolitical hegemony across diverse regions of the globe, all under the deceptively benevolent guise of humanitarianism, democracy promotion, and selfless global assistance? Is there, therefore, a fundamentally hidden, cynical, and geopolitically aggressive agenda meticulously driving USAID's vast global operations, strategically and systematically masked and relentlessly obscured by the carefully constructed and endlessly propagated aid FOD that dominates the agency's public relations messaging and its carefully controlled media narratives? A growing chorus of researchers, analysts, and increasingly skeptical global observers now believe the overwhelmingly compelling answer to these deeply disturbing questions is a resounding and ethically devastating yes. USAID, far from being a neutral humanitarian actor, is demonstrably functioning as a key instrument in a broader, more insidious, and ultimately destabilizing U.S. geopolitical strategy of global dominance and neo-colonial power projection, effectively weaponizing aid to achieve its often hidden and ethically questionable objectives. Across the increasingly interconnected and information-saturated globe, a palpable and undeniable pattern of negative reaction and growing global rejection of USAID's operations is demonstrably emerging, a stark and increasingly loud warning signal that the world is becoming increasingly wary, skeptical, and deeply distrustful of USAID's meticulously constructed public image and its relentlessly propagated narratives regarding its true intentions and operational modalities. A growing and geographically diverse list of sovereign nations, spanning disparate continents, diverse political systems, and varied cultural contexts, have, over recent years and decades, taken increasingly drastic and unprecedented action against USAID's operations within their sovereign borders, forcefully expelling USAID operatives and staff, significantly restricting the agency's operational scope, or publicly and vehemently accusing USAID of direct interference in their internal political affairs, systematic subversion of their national sovereignty, and clandestine operations aimed at destabilizing their legitimately constituted governments. Bolivia, for instance, under the leadership of then-President Evo Morales, forcefully expelled USAID from the country in 2013, citing irrefutable evidence of USAID's direct and covert interference in Bolivian internal political processes and its clandestine funding of anti-government opposition groups. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, followed suit in 2012, officially expelling USAID from Russian territory, accusing the agency of demonstrably funding and strategically supporting Russian organizations and activist groups explicitly aimed at undermining the legitimacy of the Russian government and actively fomenting political instability within the Russian Federation, violating Russia's national sovereignty and directly contravening international law. Venezuela, under the leadership of the late President Hugo Chavez and subsequently President Nicolas Maduro, has repeatedly expelled USAID operatives and severely restricted its operations within Venezuelan territory, consistently and vehemently accusing USAID of being a front organization for U.S. intelligence agencies and actively engaging in destabilization campaigns aimed at overthrowing the socialist government and undermining Venezuelan national sovereignty. Ecuador, under former President Rafael Correa, joined the growing list of nations deeply distrustful of USAID, terminating its cooperation agreements with the agency in 2014 and expressing profound concerns about USAID's true objectives and its potential for covert interference in Ecuadorian internal affairs. These demonstrably not isolated incidents or paranoid reactions from allegedly authoritarian regimes, as often simplistically portrayed within dominant Western media narratives. Instead, these expulsions and restrictions represent a widening and increasingly vocal chorus of global distrust directed squarely at USAID and its demonstrably problematic operational modalities, a widespread and deeply rooted sense across diverse regions of the world that the agency's carefully constructed humanitarian facade is demonstrably crumbling under the accumulating weight of mounting suspicion, empirical evidence, and global geopolitical realities. When an increasingly diverse array of sovereign nations, spanning diverse continents and distinct political spectrums, begin to perceive and publicly denounce USAID not as a benevolent and impartial aid provider, genuinely committed to selfless humanitarian assistance and sustainable development, but rather as a potentially malign and geopolitically manipulative tool of foreign interference, covert subversion, and U.S. hegemonic power projection, it becomes ethically imperative and strategically unavoidable to ask, is the meticulously constructed and relentlessly propagated humanitarian facade of USAID finally and demonstrably cracking under the weight of its own internal contradictions and increasingly transparent geopolitical realities? Is the uncomfortable truth about USAID's true nature, ITS hidden agendas, and ITS problematic global impact slowly, but surely and inexorably leaking out onto the global stage, undermining its carefully crafted image and eroding its long-term operational legitimacy on a truly global scale? These growing negative reactions and increasingly frequent expulsions represent a loud and clear global warning sign that can no longer be strategically ignored or simplistically dismissed as mere authoritarian paranoia. The world is demonstrably waking up to the increasingly troubling realities of USAID's global operations, and the agency's carefully constructed humanitarian facade is showing undeniable and potentially irreparable cracks. Stepping dramatically back from the granular details of USAID's operational history, financial structures, and geopolitical interventions, and adopting a strategically panoramic and globally encompassing analytical perspective, the ultimate, existentially profound, and profoundly disturbing question that must now be rigorously and unflinchingly confronted is this: is USAID, despite its relentlessly reiterated rhetoric of noble humanitarianism, benevolent democracy promotion, and selfless global assistance in reality, and in its demonstrably consistent global impact, actually playing a deeply significant and potentially catastrophic role in the systemic destabilization of the entire global order as we have known it for decades? By consistently engaging in what a growing chorus of international legal scholars, geopolitical analysts, and increasingly skeptical sovereign governments now perceive as unilateral and neo-colonial interventionism in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, by systematically and selectively funding political opposition movements and undermining legitimately constituted governments deemed unfriendly to U.S. interests, by demonstrably and repeatedly operating with a glaring lack of transparency, ethical accountability, and genuine independent oversight that inevitably breeds suspicion, distrust, and deep-seated resentment across the globe, is USAID. Whether inadvertently through strategic incompetence or deliberately through calculated geopolitical design, actively and consequentially fueling global instability, systematically eroding the already fragile fabric of international law, and progressively undermining the increasingly precious and essential global trust and cooperation between nations that are demonstrably indispensable for maintaining any semblance of global peace, security, and long-term sustainable development in an increasingly interconnected and dangerously volatile 21st century, is the agency so ostensibly dedicated to the ostensibly benevolent and universally desirable goals of making the world a better place through humanitarian aid and democracy promotion, in fact, and in its actual geopolitical impact, becoming a potent and increasingly dangerous force for global destabilization, a sophisticated and ethically problematic weapon of chaos, operating strategically and often clandestinely under a carefully constructed and increasingly transparent benevolent mask? Is it, therefore, urgently and ethically imperative for the global community to demand a radical and fundamental reassessment of USAID's underlying role in the world, a comprehensive and unflinching rethink of its stated mission, its actual operational modalities, and its ultimately destructive global impact? Before the long-term geopolitical consequences of its actions become demonstrably and irreversibly catastrophic for the future of global peace, security, and the fragile prospects for a genuinely stable and cooperative international order in the decades to come, the stakes are demonstrably and existentially incredibly high, and the time to confront these profoundly uncomfortable and strategically unavoidable questions with unflinching honesty, intellectual rigor, and a deep commitment to global peace and ethical governance is unequivocally now, before it becomes definitively and tragically too late to avert the potentially catastrophic consequences of unchecked and unaccountable global power projection operating under the guise of humanitarian aid. Turning our analytical gaze to the contemporary geopolitical landscape, it becomes immediately and strategically apparent that the epicenter of global power competition is decisively and irrevocably shifting towards the vast and dynamic continent of Asia, specifically the strategically crucial Indo-Pacific region. This sprawling maritime and continental expanse is rapidly emerging as the primary arena for the intensifying, epoch-defining rivalry between the United States, the established global superpower desperately seeking to maintain its hegemonic dominance, and the People's Republic of China, the rapidly ascending global power aggressively challenging the existing US-dominated world order and resolutely projecting its growing economic, political, and military influence across the globe. In this context of escalating great power competition and intensifying geopolitical maneuvering, USAID is undergoing a dramatic and highly significant strategic reorientation, aggressively and demonstrably expanding its operational footprint across the Indo-Pacific with unprecedented speed, scale, and strategic intensity. A veritable tsunami of new USAID programs and strategic initiatives is being launched across Asia, encompassing a diverse array of nations strategically bordering China, island nations critically positioned within key maritime trade routes, and strategically vital regional actors perceived as crucial in the evolving US-China power balance within the Indo-Pacific theater. These burgeoning USAID programs are, predictably and almost formulaically, meticulously framed and publicly marketed in the familiar, reassuring, and deliberately innocuous language of aid for sustainable economic development, essential infrastructure projects, transparent and accountable good governance, and the ever-present, ideologically charged banner of democracy promotion. But beneath the carefully constructed, benevolent surface of these ostensibly altruistic and universally beneficial-sounding initiatives, is there a far more cynical, strategically calculated, and geopolitically aggressive imperative fundamentally at play? Is the true, underlying, and often undeclared agenda driving this massive USAID expansion in the Indo-Pacific truly and solely about genuine, selfless aid and impartial development, as the agency's public relations messaging relentlessly insists? Or is it, in stark and disturbing reality, fundamentally and strategically about the far more politically charged and geopolitically consequential objective of aggressively containing the rapidly growing economic, political, and military influence of China across Asia, systematically encircling China within a network of U.S.-aligned states and strategic partnerships, and strategically maintaining and consolidating U.S. hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region in the face of a rising Chinese superpower, relentlessly challenging American global dominance? Is USAID, therefore, becoming a key instrument, a subtle yet strategically potent soft power weapon, in a far broader and far more dangerous U.S. strategy to counter China, militarily encircle China, economically constrain China, ideologically undermine China, and ultimately, strategically contain China's global rise and maintain U.S. unipolar hegemony in Asia, all under the increasingly transparent and strategically dubious guise of humanitarianism and development aid? Is the strategically vital and economically dynamic Indo-Pacific region becoming, in the 21st century, the new geopolitical frontline, the next global battleground for USAID's demonstrably problematic and historically controversial geopolitical operations, skillfully and strategically masked and deployed under a freshly minted, Asia-centric aid FOD? The sheer scale, strategic focus, and geopolitical timing of USAID's unprecedented expansion in the Indo-Pacific region urgently raises serious red flags and demands immediate, rigorous, and unflinchingly critical public scrutiny from both within Asia and across the globe. Nowhere is USAID's newly intensified and strategically laser-focused operational emphasis on Asia more acute, more politically charged, and more potentially explosive than in the strategically pivotal and geopolitically hypersensitive case of Taiwan. This vibrant, democratic, but internationally isolated island nation, claimed by the People's Republic of China as a renegade province awaiting eventual reunification with the mainland, is unequivocally the ultimate flashpoint in the increasingly fraught and potentially catastrophic U.S.-China relations, the single most dangerous and volatile point of potential military conflict between the two global superpowers, and USAID is now demonstrably and deeply enmeshed in Taiwanese affairs on an unprecedented scale. USAID, with explicit backing from the U.S. government and bipartisan support within the U.S. Congress, is strategically and aggressively pouring millions upon millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars into Taiwan annually, systematically funding a wide array of programs and initiatives ostensibly and publicly aimed at bolstering Taiwanese democracy, strengthening Taiwanese civil society, promoting media independence, and countering Chinese disinformation within Taiwan's vibrant and fiercely contested information space. But is this dramatically expanded USAID presence in Taiwan and its massive financial inflows into Taiwanese civil society truly and solely about genuinely helping Taiwanese democracy to flourish and indigenously evolve in accordance with the freely expressed will of the Taiwanese people? Or is it also, and perhaps more fundamentally and dangerously, about deliberately and strategically provoking the Beijing government, undermining the long-standing U.S. One China policy, and actively escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait in a high-stakes, zero-sum geopolitical game with potentially catastrophic regional and global consequences? The government of the People's Republic of China, with unwavering consistency and escalating rhetorical force, vehemently views any form of U.S. official engagement with Taiwan, especially through politically and strategically charged agencies like USAID, as a direct and unacceptable challenge to its core national interests, a blatant violation of its sovereignty over Taiwan, and an increasingly provocative step towards de facto recognition of Taiwanese independence, a red line for Beijing that could potentially trigger a violent military response across the Taiwan Strait. By aggressively and demonstrably funding pro-democracy groups, anti-communist NGOs, and stridently anti-China media outlets in Taiwan under the auspices of USAID programs, is the U.S. government, through its ostensibly aid agency, genuinely and responsibly supporting the sustainable development of Taiwanese democracy in a peaceful and non-provocative manner? Or is it, in reality, actively and deliberately escalating geopolitical tensions with an increasingly assertive and strategically sensitive China, proactively increasing the danger of military confrontation in the Taiwan Strait and cynically undermining the delicate geopolitical balance of power in the region through a strategically reckless and ethically questionable policy of democracy provocation, disguised as benevolent aid? Is USAID's increasingly prominent and massively funded presence in Taiwan a responsible force for long-term regional peace, stability, and genuine democratic development? Or is it, more disturbingly, a calculated geopolitical provocation, a strategically reckless and potentially catastrophic Trojan horse deliberately designed to destabilize the region, undermine China's core security interests, and aggressively contain China's rise, regardless of the potentially devastating consequences for Taiwan itself, regional peace, and global security? The stakes in Taiwan are almost unimaginably high. The potential for miscalculation and catastrophic conflict is demonstrably real, and USAID's increasingly prominent and politically charged role in Taiwan urgently demands unflinching critical scrutiny and a fundamental reevaluation of its true objectives and its potentially disastrous geopolitical impact. Across the extraordinarily diverse, culturally complex, and often politically volatile landscape of Asia, USAID is demonstrably and increasingly targeting its aid, resources, and democracy promotion initiatives with a strategically calculated and potentially explosive selectivity towards strategically chosen ethnic minorities and politically marginalized dissident groups residing within the borders of sovereign Asian nations that the People's Republic of China legitimately and historically considers to be within its traditional sphere of influence, its strategically vital geopolitical periphery, or even, in some cases, integral parts of its own sovereign territory. This strategically targeted and politically charged approach demonstrably encompasses regions and populations within China itself, such as the strategically sensitive regions of Xinjiang, home to the Uyghur Muslim minority, Tibet, with its distinct Buddhist culture and historical aspirations for autonomy, and Hong Kong, with its vibrant pro-democracy movement and history of British colonial administration, as well as ethnically and politically complex nations bordering China, such as Myanmar, with its numerous ethnic insurgencies and Rohingya Muslim minority crisis, and even regions within traditionally U.S.-aligned nations like the Philippines and India, where ethnic separatist movements and regional autonomist aspirations persist and potentially destabilize national unity. While USAID strategically and predictably frames this highly selective and politically sensitive targeting of aid resources as inherently noble and ethically justifiable, explicitly presented as principled support for human rights, promotion of religious freedom, and advancement of ethnic inclusion for marginalized and vulnerable populations. This demonstrably selective and strategically targeted approach is demonstrably fraught with inherent geopolitical dangers and raises deeply troubling ethical and strategic questions regarding USAID's true long-term objectives and its potential to actively destabilize regional peace and undermine national sovereignty in strategically sensitive parts of Asia. In multi-ethnic, multi-religious nations across Asia already inherently grappling with pre-existing internal ethnic tensions, fragile intercommunal relations, and persistent separatist tendencies, is USAID's strategically selective aid and demonstrably politically charged democracy promotions truly and responsibly fostering genuine ethnic inclusion, promoting intercommunal harmony, and strengthening national unity? Or is it, more alarmingly, inadvertently, through strategic incompetence, or perhaps even intentionally, through a deliberately destabilizing geopolitical design, fueling ethnic separatism, exacerbating pre-existing regional instabilities, and potentially unleashing long-term cycles of ethnic conflict, civil unrest, and even widespread violence in strategically volatile and geopolitically hypersensitive regions across Asia, all under the deceptively benign and ethically questionable banner of humanitarianism? Is USAID strategically and recklessly playing with ethnic fire in already explosive geopolitical regions across Asia, cynically and strategically weaponizing ethnic grievances and separatist aspirations for broader geopolitical gain under the increasingly transparent and ethically bankrupt guise of humanitarianism and democracy promotion? The long-term geopolitical consequences of this demonstrably selective and strategically targeted approach to aid in ethnically diverse and politically sensitive regions of Asia could be demonstrably devastating for regional stability, international peace, and the prospects for sustainable development across this strategically vital continent. Taking a strategically panoramic and geopolitically encompassing view across the vast and increasingly contested landscape of Asia, meticulously analyzing the broad sweep and rapid pace of USAID's unprecedented expansion across the continent, critically assessing its demonstrably strategic focus on containing China and strategically encircling its geopolitical rise, closely examining its demonstrably politically charged activities in geopolitical hotspots like Taiwan and the South China Sea, and unflinchingly scrutinizing its strategically targeted aid and democracy promotion initiatives demonstrably aimed at ethnic minorities and dissident groups in strategically sensitive regions bordering or within China's sphere of influence, a chilling and overarching question of truly epical geopolitical significance inevitably and urgently forces itself upon global attention and critical public discourse. Is USAID, in the rapidly evolving geopolitical context of the early 21st century, actively and consequentially engaged in a strategic and profoundly dangerous process of systematically transforming the entire continent of Asia into a vast, multipolar, and potentially explosive new geopolitical battleground, a primary theater for great power competition, ideological confrontation, and escalating military tensions in a rapidly destabilizing global order, all under the increasingly transparent and ethically questionable guise of benevolent aid, selfless development, and universally appealing democracy promotion? Is the strategically vital Indo-Pacific region the economic engine of the 21st century and the fulcrum of the emerging global power balance, rapidly and tragically becoming the next geopolitical frontier for USAID's demonstrably problematic and historically controversial covert operations, clandestine regime change efforts, and deliberate geopolitical maneuvering, effectively mirroring its demonstrably destabilizing operational history in Latin America during the Cold War, Eastern Europe in the post-Soviet era, and the Middle East in the wake of the War on Terror? Are we, in Asia, on the precipice of witnessing the dawn of a new, Asian-centric Cold War, strategically orchestrated and aggressively prosecuted through the subtle but potent instruments of soft power and economic influence, effectively disguised and masked as benign humanitarianism, with USAID demonstrably functioning as a key, strategically indispensable, and deeply problematic instrument in this potentially catastrophic global power struggle, hidden and strategically deployed behind a meticulously constructed and increasingly hollow humanitarian facade? Is it, therefore, critically urgent and geopolitically imperative for nations across Asia, and indeed for the global community as a whole, to finally wake up to the increasingly troubling reality of USAID's true operational nature, to resolutely see USAID for what it is demonstrably becoming in the 21st century, to unflinchingly question the agency's carefully constructed official narratives, and to demand radical transparency, ethical accountability, and fundamental reforms of its global operations before Asia itself becomes the next theater of catastrophic geopolitical conflict and potentially devastating interstate war, and the increasingly fragile aid facade of USAID crumbles completely, revealing a far more sinister and geopolitically dangerous truth beneath the surface of its meticulously cultivated public image? The long-term future of peace, stability, and sustainable development across Asia, and indeed the very trajectory of the emerging global order in the 21st century, may well critically and tragically depend on our collective willingness to confront these profoundly uncomfortable and strategically unavoidable questions with unflinching intellectual honesty, ethical courage, and an unwavering commitment to global peace and justice. We have journeyed together through a disturbing and meticulously documented exploration of USAID's operational history, its complex financial structures, its ethically ambiguous activities in geopolitical hotspots, and its rapidly expanding presence in the strategically critical continent of Asia. We have unflinchingly confronted a litany of deeply troubling allegations, persistent scandals, and recurring patterns of behavior that cast a long and ominous shadow of suspicion over the agency's carefully crafted image of benevolent humanitarianism and selfless global aid. From the politically tainted aids of the Cold War era, weaponized to contain communism and prop up authoritarian regimes, to the dark specter of regime change operations in Chile and beyond, facilitated by USAID funding and strategically deployed front NGOs, we have uncovered a historical legacy deeply marred by ethical compromises and politically motivated interventions. We have delved into the endemic scandals of corruption and embezzlement, revealing a pattern of massive financial irregularities and systemic waste that raises profound questions about USAID's accountability, its operational efficiency, and the true destination of billions of taxpayer dollars ostensibly earmarked for humanitarian assistance. We have dissected the labyrinthine financial flows of USAID, exposing a deliberately opaque and strategically convoluted subcontracting system that functions as a vast financial black box, shielding the agency from genuine public scrutiny, independent oversight, and ethical accountability, potentially facilitating clandestine operations and the untraceable funding of hidden geopolitical agendas. We have meticulously examined the devastating geopolitical consequences of USAID's actions, revealing a disturbing pattern of democracy promotion initiatives that often lead to chaos, instability, and violent conflict, inadvertently or intentionally weakening non-aligned governments and promoting U.S. geopolitical interests under the guise of benevolent aid. We have taken note of the growing global pushback against USAID, with a rising chorus of sovereign nations expelling USAID operatives, restricting its operations, and publicly denouncing its activities as covert interference and neo-colonial subversion, signaling a global erosion of trust in the agency's humanitarian facade. And finally, we have focused our analytical lens on the current strategic relevance of USAID in Asia, exposing its aggressive expansion in the Indo-Pacific region, its politically charged activities in Taiwan, and its strategically targeted aid to ethnic minorities and dissident groups in China's periphery, raising the deeply unsettling question: is USAID, in the 21st century, transforming Asia into a new geopolitical battleground under the familiar guise of aid and development? In essence, the evidence we have meticulously examined and unflinchingly confronted throughout this investigation compels us to ask a profoundly uncomfortable and strategically unavoidable question. Is USAID, at its operational core, truly and unquestionably a benevolent humanitarian agency, genuinely dedicated to its publicly stated mission of alleviating global suffering, promoting sustainable development, and fostering democracy worldwide, as its carefully crafted public image relentlessly insists? Or is it, perhaps more disturbingly, also functioning, and perhaps even primarily functioning, as a sophisticated, financially powerful, and geopolitically manipulative instrument of U.S. foreign policy, a soft power weapon strategically deployed to advance U.S. geopolitical interests, undermine rival powers, and maintain U.S. global hegemony, skillfully and systematically masked behind a meticulously constructed and increasingly transparent humanitarian facade? What do you believe? After examining this evidence, considering this historical context, and reflecting on the global impact of USAID's operations, what is your conclusion? The uncomfortable, and for many, perhaps shocking truth, is that the lines between aid and covert action, between humanitarianism and geopolitical manipulation, between benevolence and power projection, have become increasingly blurred, dangerously indistinct, and perhaps, in the case of USAID, almost completely erased. The evidence strongly suggests that USAID, while undoubtedly engaging in some genuinely beneficial humanitarian activities, is also demonstrably and systematically operating as a highly sophisticated and deeply problematic arm of U.S. geopolitical power, a tool strategically deployed to advance U.S. interests, often at the expense of genuine human development, national sovereignty, and global stability. And the stakes, in this new era of escalating global power competition and intensifying geopolitical tensions, are higher than ever before. The future of entire regions, the stability of the global order, and the very prospects for peace and sustainable development in the 21st century may well hinge on our collective willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths, to demand transparency and accountability, and to fundamentally rethink the role and impact of USAID on the world stage. This is not merely an academic debate. This is a global imperative. We cannot afford to remain silent. We cannot afford to remain complacent. We must act. Now. Here are the immediate and concrete actions that you can take to make a difference, to demand accountability, and to expose the truth about USAID and its global impact. Educate yourself further. Dig deeper. Share this information. Don't rely solely on mainstream media narratives. Seek out independent investigative journalism, critical geopolitical analysis, and alternative perspectives on USAID and U.S. foreign policy. Share this script. Share this video. Share this information widely across your social networks, with your friends, your family, your colleagues, your communities. The first step to change is awareness. Spread the word. Make this go viral. Demand transparency from USAID and the U.S. government. Contact your elected representatives. Write to your senators and congressmen. Demand that they launch independent investigations and rigorous audits of USAID's budget, its operations, and its global impact. Demand full financial transparency. Demand access to USAID's internal documents and operational records. Demand TO know where your taxpayer dollars are really going and what they are really being used for in the name of aid. Support independent journalism and critical investigation into USAID. Fund independent media outlets, investigative journalists, and researchers who are willing to ask the tough questions, to challenge the official narratives, and to expose the uncomfortable truths about USAID and its global operations. Your financial support empowers real journalism and holds power accountable. Engage in public discourse and demand accountability on social media. Use social media platforms to raise awareness about the issues surrounding USAID. Use hashtags like #USAIDTruth, #AidOrDestabilization, #ExposeUSAID, #GeopoliticalWeapon. Engage in respectful but firm debate and discussion. Demand accountability from USAID officials, U.S. policymakers, and media outlets that uncritically promote the agency's narratives. Make your voice heard. Organize and mobilize for systemic change. Connect with grassroots organizations, activist groups, and civil society movements that are working to promote transparency, accountability, and ethical foreign policy. Organize protests. Sign petitions. Lobby for policy reforms. Demand a fundamental rethink of U.S. foreign aid and a radical restructuring of USAID to ensure genuine humanitarianism, transparency, and accountability, and to prevent the weaponization of aid for geopolitical gain. Which of these actions will you commit to taking today? What step will you take right now to join this growing global movement for truth and accountability regarding USAID? Share your commitment in the comments below. This is not just about USAID. This is about the future of global order. This is about the very soul of humanitarianism. We cannot allow aid to be weaponized. We must demand truth. We must demand accountability. We must demand change. Before it is too late. The world is watching. History is recording. The truth about USAID will be exposed. The question is, will you be part of the generation that demanded accountability, that unmasked the facade, and that fought for a more just, more transparent, and more ethical global order? The choice and the responsibility is yours.